They say the quietest moments in the night are when the truth whispers loudest. That night, as the shadows danced against the walls and the house was eerily still, I heard footsteps outside my door, soft, hesitant but deliberate. At first, I thought it was my husband coming to check on me, but the air shifted, and something felt off. My heart stilled as the doorknob turned ever so slowly. A figure stepped into the room, the dim moonlight casting just enough glow to outline his face. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. It wasn't my husband. It was my stepson. And in that moment, every instinct screamed at me to ask, what does he want, and why does he look so much like his father in this light? I'm Emma, a 37-year-old woman who thought she had mastered the delicate art of blending families. When I married David 3 years ago, I knew he came with baggage, not the kind you unpack and tuck neatly into drawers, but the living, breathing kind that looks you in the eye and demands answers to questions you're not ready to face. His son, Liam, was 21 at the time, still reeling from his parents' messy divorce. Liam wasn't what you'd call a typical young man. He carried himself with an unsettling maturity, his dark eyes always watching, calculating, as though he was dissecting the world around him. He inherited David's broad shoulders and sharp jawline, but there was something softer about him, a vulnerability he worked hard to hide behind a mask of indifference. I wanted to bridge the gap between us, to be the stepmother who eased his pain rather than adding to it. But Liam kept his distance, his politeness tinged with coldness, his smiles rarely reaching his eyes. David and I shared a quiet life in our suburban home, the kind of place where the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of wind were the only sounds at night. Our house was modest but warm, filled with mismatched furniture that told the story of two people trying to merge their lives. Liam stayed with us sporadically, dropping in between semesters at college. Those visits were always brief, marked by strained conversations and unspoken tensions. The night it all began, the air was heavy with the scent of rain, the kind that clung to the earth and seeped into the walls. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day at work. David had stayed downstairs, nursing a whiskey and flipping through channels on the television. The soft hum of the TV drifted up the stairs, a comforting reminder of his presence. I remember staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks with my eyes, letting the distant rumble of thunder lull me towards sleep. The bedroom was dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through the sheer curtains, casting soft shadows that danced on the walls. It was a picture of serenity, a moment where nothing seemed out of place. But beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of unease I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the way Liam had looked at me earlier that evening, his gaze lingering just a second too long, or the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, as though we shared a secret no one else could understand. I had brushed it off, blaming my overactive imagination, but as the night wore on, that sense of something unspoken grew stronger, settling deep in my chest. I didn't know it then, but that night would unravel everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the boundaries we're never supposed to cross. It started with a whisper. "Emma," he said, his voice soft, almost too soft, like he was afraid of waking a ghost. My eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, I forgot where I was. The dim light in the room, the rhythmic tapping of rain against the window, it all felt dreamlike. But then I saw him, standing just inside the doorway, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of the hallway light. It was Liam. "Liam," I said, sitting up and clutching the blanket to my chest. "What are you doing here?" He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was walking a tightrope. I noticed his hands were trembling, and his usually guarded expression was replaced by something I couldn't quite place, something raw, almost desperate. "I couldn't sleep," he said, his eyes meeting mine briefly before darting away. "I needed to talk to you." I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 2:13 a.m. What could possibly be so urgent at this hour? "About what?" I asked, my voice steady despite the unease curling in my stomach. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "About us." The room seemed to shrink around me, the air growing heavier with every passing second. "Us?" The word echoed in my mind, sharp and jarring. "Liam, I think you're confused," I said carefully, my tone firm but not unkind. "There is no us. You're my stepson." "But that's just it," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I don't feel like you're my stepmother. I've never felt that way." His words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, of what he was saying. "Liam, this is," I started, but he cut me off. "Don't," he said, his tone pleading. Don't pretend you don't feel it too. Feel it too? The audacity of his assumption sent a wave of anger crashing over me, but beneath that anger was something more unsettling: doubt. Had I done something to give him the wrong idea? Had I misread the quiet tension between us, chalking it up to the normal awkwardness of blended families? You're imagining things, I said finally, my voice sharper than I intended. Go back to bed. But he didn't move. Instead, he took another step closer, his face now fully illuminated by the moonlight. His dark eyes bore into mine, filled with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. Emma, he said again, softer this time. I've tried to ignore it, to push it down, but it's always there. Every time I see you, every time you smile at me, I can't stop thinking about you. My chest tightened, and I felt a wave of nausea rise within me. This couldn't be happening. This shouldn't be happening. Liam, stop, I said, my voice trembling. This isn't right. You need to leave. Just listen to me, he pleaded, his voice breaking. I know it's wrong, but I can't help how I feel. And I think. Don't you dare finish that sentence, I snapped, cutting him off. This is over. Right now. The silence that followed was deafening. He stood there for a moment, his face a mixture of heartbreak and defiance, before finally turning and walking toward the door. But just as he reached it, he stopped and turned back to me. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I needed you to know. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the dark, my mind racing and my heart pounding. I lay back against the pillows, staring up at the ceiling, my thoughts a chaotic jumble. Had I missed the signs? Had I done something, anything, to encourage this? The memory of his lingering gazes, his subtle touches, and his too intimate compliments played in my mind like a haunting melody. I thought of David, sleeping soundly downstairs, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing under his roof. Should I tell him? Could I even find the words? The weight of Liam's confession settled over me, suffocating and inescapable. And as the rain continued to fall outside, I realized with a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. The morning after Liam's late-night confession felt like walking through a fog. I went through the motions, brewing coffee, tidying up the kitchen, trying to convince myself that the events of the previous night had been a bad dream. But the truth lingered in the air like the faint scent of rain on the pavement, impossible to ignore. David was sitting at the dining table, engrossed in the morning paper. His face, lined with the quiet confidence of a man who believed his family was intact, was a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. I wanted to tell him everything, to unload the weight pressing on my chest, but the words caught in my throat. Liam appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the room like a sudden gust of wind. His eyes met mine for the briefest moment, and I saw it, the same raw vulnerability, the same silent plea. He looked away quickly, clearing his throat as he greeted his father. Morning, Liam said, his voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil from the night before. David glanced up and smiled. Morning, son. Sleep well? Yeah, Liam replied, sliding into the chair across from him. I busied myself at the counter, keeping my back to them. My hands trembled as I poured my coffee, the ceramic mug threatening to slip from my grip. I could feel Liam's gaze on me, heavy and unrelenting. Emma. David's voice broke through my thoughts. Are you okay? You're awfully quiet this morning. I turned to face him, forcing a smile. I'm fine. Just didn't sleep well. David frowned, but before he could press further, Liam stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I need to talk to you, Liam said, his eyes locked on mine. David looked between us, confusion knitting his brow. What's going on? Not now, Liam said, his tone firm. It's important. I felt the color drain from my face. This couldn't be happening, not here, not in front of David. Liam, I said, my voice low and warning. But he didn't back down. Instead, he stepped closer, his jaw set with determination. You don't get to pretend nothing happened, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. David stood, his confusion turning to alarm. What the hell are you talking about? The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in around us. I could see the realization dawning on David's face, the pieces clicking into place. Liam, I said sharply, trying to regain control of the situation. Stop this. But Liam was past the point of no return. I told her how I feel, he said, his voice cracking. Last night, I told Emma everything. David's face went pale, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying I'm in love with her," Liam said, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "And I think she feels the same way." "That's enough," I shouted, my voice echoing in the small kitchen. The silence that followed was deafening. David turned to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and betrayal. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice trembling. "No," I said firmly, shaking my head. "I don't feel that way." "Liam's confused, and he's misinterpreted things." "Misinterpreted?" Liam said, his voice rising. "You know that's not true. You felt it too. I've seen it in the way you look at me, the way you—" "Stop!" I shouted again, tears streaming down my face. "This isn't love, Liam. It's a fantasy, and it needs to end. Now." David's face hardened, his jaw tightening as he stepped between us. "Liam, you need to leave," he said, his voice cold and final. "But—" "Now," David said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Liam hesitated, his eyes flickering between us, before finally turning and storming out of the room. The sound of the front door slamming reverberated through the house, leaving an unbearable silence in its wake. David turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice quiet. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came. How could I explain something I didn't fully understand myself? "I didn't want to hurt you," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "You already have," he said, his words cutting deeper than I thought possible. And just like that, the fragile foundation of our family shattered, leaving nothing but jagged edges and unanswered questions. The days that followed were a blur of silence and separation. Liam didn't return to the house, and David barely spoke to me. The once warm rhythm of our home was replaced by a cold, suffocating tension. I spent hours replaying everything in my mind: Liam's confession, David's reaction, the moments that led us here. David and I shared a quiet dinner one evening, the clinking of forks against plates the only sound. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with exhaustion. "Do you love him?" he asked, his eyes never leaving his plate. The question caught me off guard, but I answered immediately. "No. Not in the way he thinks." He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected my answer but needed to hear it out loud. "I don't know if I can forgive this," he said, his voice breaking. The weight of his words settled over me, but I couldn't argue. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the shadows danced across it. I thought of Liam, of his pain, his confusion, and the intensity of his emotions. I couldn't hate him, even after everything. He was young, lost, and searching for something he thought he saw in me. And maybe, in some way, I'd failed him by not recognizing the signs sooner, by not setting clearer boundaries. But I also thought of David, of the life we'd built together and the quiet love we shared. I realized that love is more than passion or attraction. It's about trust, respect, and the quiet moments of understanding that bind people together. Liam had mistaken infatuation for love, but David's love was steady, unwavering, and real. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Our family would never be the same, but maybe that was the point. Sometimes, the cracks in our lives reveal truths we've been too afraid to face. I don't know what the future holds, whether David and I can repair what's been broken or whether Liam will find the clarity he needs. But I do know this: love in all its forms is messy, complicated, and imperfect. And perhaps it's in that imperfection that we find what it truly means to be human.